Hello, students. Today we need to look at a little bit of history in order to set the stage for Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, published in 1891, which is generally considered to be the beginning of modern Catholic social teaching. We'll start with the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, many new inventions were made, such as the spinning jenny, the power loom, the Watt steam engine, and then later on the sewing machine. What this allowed to develop was factories, places where many people could come together and work more efficiently, producing more things. In the case of the inventions that I mentioned, especially more cloth, more clothing. This led to radical shifts in the society. During the same time in Britain, where the Industrial Revolution began, there was also going on enclosure. Enclosure was driven by big landowners and driven by Parliament. What it was taking lands that had been farmed in common, often for generations, and enclosing those, making those part of a bigger parcel of land that belonged to the large landowner. Therefore, the farmers that used to use them, the farmers that used to farm there in order to stay alive, could no longer do that. They had to look for other ways to stay alive, to keep their families alive. That disrupted their culture, disrupted their way of living. Many of them moved to the cities in order to find employment. There in the cities, you saw very clearly the new social classes that were developing. During feudal times, you had the aristocracy, the landed owners who had inherited their property. You had the peasants down in the bottom. And then from the Middle Ages on, you had another class, the middle class, which was merchants and others who steadily kind of rose in influence, and especially with the Industrial Revolution, were the ones who ended up being the owners of the means of production, making money, pushing the aristocracy out of the way. The aristocracy becomes obsolete, and you end up with two basic classes, the capitalists or bourgeoisie, and then the laborers or the proletariat. The capitalists own the means of production, land, factories, raw materials, ways of making stuff, and the laborers own themselves, have their bodies, have their ability to work. They contract with the capitalists to put in a certain amount of work for a certain amount of pay. You end up with those two classes in the capitalist system developing. This created a big disparity of power. The capitalists held all the cards. They owned the means of production. The proletariat owned only themselves, and there were lots of them. There were lots of these laborers that came into the cities and needed work. So there was a surplus of workers. Therefore, the capitalists could get work for very little. And very often, they paid as little as possible to get the work that they could get. And that meant that adults often had to work under very bad conditions, work for 70 to 80 hours a week, live in squalor and small places with great overcrowding, dirt, chill, because they couldn't afford anything better. This disparity of power for the laborers was shown also in child labor. Many children had to go into work to help support their families. The capitalists like having child labor. Why? Well, they could fit into places around machines, do things on the machines that were difficult for adults to get into or to do, and then they could get paid just a fraction of what adults got paid for their labor. Often children had to work very long hours, work dangerous jobs. I read about girls working in match factories. The chemicals would cause their teeth to fall out. Awful situations before laws started coming in regulating child labor especially. Now, a note. There's many good things about the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. I'm grateful for a lot of them. For example, everything in this room, except for the organic things like me and the fish, is a result of the Industrial Revolution. So my iPhone, my cracked iPhone, is definitely a result of the Industrial Revolution. This fishnet is a result of the Industrial Revolution. This duck is a result of the Industrial Revolution. It just wouldn't be here if that hadn't happened. And I like my duck, therefore I'm grateful for the Industrial Revolution and capitalism that gave me my duck. But capitalism as such does not require employers to care about the well-being of their employees. it has a supply and demand system where if there's a lot of laborers who are willing to come and work for it, you can pay very, very little. And that led to a situation for a long period of time that was simply intolerable. That led to the exploitation of the workers, the laboring class, and everyone from Karl Marx to the Pope recognized this problem. We're going to look at Karl Marx first, the Pope next video. The Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx was not the only communist. There were many people proposing communism around Europe in the 1800s. But in 1848, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels published the Communist Manifesto, a pamphlet that was destined to become perhaps the most influential single pamphlet in world history. Karl Marx became the leading intellectual figure of communism. Communism is the idea that the means of production, again, land, factories, raw materials, those should be owned not by individuals, not by private persons, but rather by the state. And then later on, when the state dissolves, according to Marxist theory, you have it owned just by everyone in common. In this way, cutting off the inequality between rich and poor. Some points from the Communist Manifesto. One, they go through a history in more detail that I kind of briefly stated before of the overcoming of the aristocracy by the bourgeoisie. They pointed out the grave injustices that were being done under the capitalist system, talking about the slavery of the proletariat. I'll give you a quick quote from the Communist Manifesto, which, by the way, begins with a really cool line. There is a specter haunting Europe, the specter of communism. I think it's kind of inflammatory and cool. But they say this: not only are they, the proletariat, the slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. So in other words, the proletariat had become wage slaves. They were forced into bad conditions by their need to live. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels note that the workers are being herded together, the proletariat's being united by being forced into factories, forced into mines, and that that's going to be the seed of this destruction of the bourgeois because there's going to be an explosion. These united proletariat laborers are going to revolt and overthrow their oppressors. That's the communist revolution. And then as a result of this violent revolution, all the existing structures, such as religion, morality, law, the family will break apart because Marx had a theory of dialectical materialism. That's how he thought history worked. As history moves, he thinks that economics is the single driving factor in history. And when you change an economic structure, you're going to change all the other structures too. For example, within the family, women and children were dependent on men at that time for economic needs. If economics is the only thing driving history, then when there's no longer a need for women and children to depend on men for money, once private property is abolished, then the family will necessarily dissolve because there won't be anything to hold it together. That's what Marx would say. And then Marxist atheism. Marxism is essentially atheistic. The famous line, of course, from Marx is that religion is the opiate of the people. Opium is a drug. He's saying that religion acts like a drug that keeps the proletariat from rising up, from overthrowing their oppressors by promising happiness in a life to come. Therefore, they don't take care of things here in this life and just kind of continue under oppression. So that's one of the reasons why he wants to get rid of religion, because it keeps the masses from rising up from the revolution. Pope Leo XIII. When we get to Rerum Novarum in the next video, what we're going to see is two striking things. One, that the Pope also sees a lot of the problems in the same way that Marx does. His analysis of the situation that the Industrial Revolution and capitalism have brought about is very much like Marx and Engels. But his solution is radically different. As you can guess, the Pope does not espouse atheism. The Pope does not espouse the dissolution of the family or the destruction of all the the things that are there in society. We will look at what he does propose next time.